to use this debate. I mean, scientists should be debating, contesting each other constantly. That's what allows the cream to rise to the top, and that's where truth will, and certainty which we'll never get to, but I guess science is an issue of probabilities, and let's hope you cause this audience to be heard and continue your good debate. Having said that, though, as a non-expert, as you can appreciate, I'm sure, we must rely upon the preponderance of evidence and preponderance of scientists as to what their opinion are. And all we can do is encourage the debate and see what the result is when your ideas are contested with other scientists in the world. And having said that, I'm sure you acknowledge that the great majority of scientists don't agree with your conclusions. They probably appreciate some of your data, but they don't agree. And that's the observation we could only make, because we're not able enough to decipher all this stuff. Having said that, what audience have you received? What is the process that you've made public your ideas and what audience are you getting there? Are you making progress? And why is it that you haven't convinced the great majority of other scientists of your views? What's the process, and you're pleased with that process? I'm not sure who wants to make a comment.
Can I? One of the issues that you heard about was the water vapor feedback effect, and the water vapor feedback effect in the models gets concentrated in the troposphere over the tropics, and there aren't a lot of papers on that topic in the literature, but there are really two identifiable groups that have been disputing it. A study that I was a co-author on that was published last year used proper statistical methods to look at the data sets and the climate models. This was published in a good atmospheric science journal, and we were able to show that the discrepancy is real between models and observations, that the models significantly overpredict the warming that's going on there. What was interesting in the new batch of climate science emails was to read from some of the people on the other team who, although they won't say it in public, in private are acknowledging that this is a problem for them, that there is no warming. And one of them even pointed out that, if anything, it's a cooling in that record. And I mentioned one of them described it as living in a fool's paradise, and they use the phrase, it's dangerous, that we're trying to carry on with this impression. So I can completely understand your position as a decision maker. You know, what do you make of the fact that you've got this institution like the IPCC and its various satellite organizations that tells you one thing, and then you keep hearing rumors of other relevant points of view. That's why I would like to shift the discussion a little bit onto getting people to understand more about what the IPCC actually is. I don't think it's as representative of scientific opinion as it's been made out to be. And also, in terms of what you should listen to, at the end of the day, it's not the authority of a scientist or the authority of anyone here. It's really the data. What are you supposed to be measuring? If we were talking about inflation or interest rates, we could say whatever we like, but you can look it up. You can look up the numbers and see for yourself. And I think that's a question that you can put to the scientists that you see. What are you predicting? How do we measure it? And what do those measurements show? Because that's what should be speaking the loudest.
Appreciate that. But even in inflation, there's a constant debate with basket of goods included. Nothing's certain, as you know. In fact, we can get the long argument. How about our own, every country, our self-interest, we would love to agree with you. In fact, human nature is such, some of us will quickly agree with you because that's what we'd love to hear. But most countries, including our own scientists, we're spending a lot of money as a country, and many countries are spending a lot of money because of the preponderance of evidence that they heard. And our own Minister of Environment recently said that the scientists within our own government agree with climate change, which is man-made, which is obviously a critical issue. But what you seem to be saying is, I think you mentioned the word, there's an elitist bias and there's momentum towards this common agreement. But I think the opposite, the bias would be, boy, they'd love to agree with you, and they would love to find what you're doing is right and save all these billions of dollars we're saving. And why is it that even the bureaucrat, which doesn't have a bias, why won't they come out and say, we agree with you. This is all wrong.
Well, I can't speak for individual bureaucrats, but between the academic community and the government science community, there is a lot less freedom for government scientists to speak. I don't put a lot of stock in the idea that someone would say all these experts all agree with a certain point of view when it's basically it's the person signing their paycheck is telling you that. How much freedom do they have to really speak out? I'm more familiar with the academic world where people have quite a bit more freedom to speak out, and I can just say among my colleagues there's lively discussion, there's a wide range of perspectives, and within people's own area of expertise they still have lots of questions about what's going on.
It's a tough one. I appreciate it. I think many people will dispute it. In fact, I think the most reasoned mind will say, you're right, we're not 100% sure this is occurring. I think nearly nobody is 100% sure. But like many decisions we do in life, we deal with high probabilities. I cross the street, when I have to look both sides and think I won't get hit. But maybe I should look 3-4 times. Nothing is certain. And therefore, many people's attitude, and I think the one that resumes best my opinion, the economist basically says we're not 100% sure climate change, but it's going to cost us 1.7 in GDP if we make the measures. If we don't measure it, if we don't do it, it's going to probably cost 5 to 10. Maybe it's 1.7, 1.9% we're wasting, but it's like an insurance policy. So they seem to acknowledge the uncertainty of the event, but it's money well spent, because what if we're wrong? It's a huge impact. You want to make a comment on that reasoning there?
And what if we are wrong the other way? How much it is going to cost us?
It's 1.7.
Also, the 1.7, there have been a lot of studies about what it would cost Canada and other countries. That 1.7 doesn't mean 1.7% of GDP to eliminate the threat of climate change. That's 1.7% of GDP to, say, reach the Kyoto target. And what would that buy you? If the models are right, it only slows the process down by 5%. So if you want to do it on a cost-benefit test, you need to be careful to make the comparison of what it is that you're actually buying with the policy. Because otherwise,
Thank you, Chair.
Did you have a supplementary, Senator Lang? Short.
Very, very quickly, talking about certainty, it would seem to me that one thing is certain is that we wake up in the morning with a thermometer and we know how cold or how warm it is. And we have 365 days a year that thermometer is registered. So surely we can at the end of the year say whether the world's cooling or it's not cooling. Perhaps you could comment on that.
Well, that's a very difficult problem, and I think Ross is perhaps the best person to talk about that. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ross. But it's a very difficult measurement, the global temperature measurement. What is that?
there are a couple of different key databases. One is the land surface temperature record, which I think has the biggest quality problems, but it's the one that is most prominently displayed. Better quality data sets come from weather satellites. Weather balloons is another source. And then Canada was also a big supporter of something called the Argo network, which is a network of 3,000 robotic floats that now travel the world's oceans, taking constant temperature readings down to a depth of about 900 meters all the way up to the surface. That's a much better quality ocean temperature data set than was available, but that only goes back to 2003. I've worked mostly with the satellite data sets because I think they're the best quality temperature data sets that we have, and they measure the region of the atmosphere where the greenhouse gases mix and the effects should be most evident. And it's the big controversy has been the fact that there's a lot more warming. There seems to be more warming at the surface than in the weather satellite data sets, and the models don't predict that discrepancy should be there. In terms of what we monitor, I think now there's a lot more attention being paid to the weather satellite data, and it's updated monthly, and that's where you begin to get the idea that to the extent there's warming, it just doesn't seem to be on the scale of what the models have predicted.
Thank you for that clarification. Senator Banks.
Thank you, Chair. As I think everybody knows, and as the exchange between Senator Massicotte and Professor McKittrick showed, we are not experts. We have the privilege of listening to experts, and we've been doing that for 2.5 years, well, longer than that in some cases. But it will fall to us to make a decision of some kind. So we have to base our decisions on the evidence that we've heard from experts, from people who either know or who purport to know, that we find the most compelling. One of the things that I think we would all agree on, and you have demonstrated it, is that there is climate change. The question, with respect to Mr. Gore and others like him, boils down to the extent to which and how much, if any, we are contributing to it. And some of the evidence we've heard is that there's an exponential difference between what we're doing and what we are emitting that has occurred in about the last 100 or 150 years. That has, to some degree, skewed the question of how much are we having an effect on it. We have learned that all predictions are wrong, that all models are wrong, because the slightest deviation from them at the beginning becomes a very wide deviation when you go out, sometimes weeks, sometimes decades, sometimes centuries. I personally believe in the precautionary principle to which Senator Massicotte referred. If I see that train coming down the road 90 miles an hour at me, and nobody can absolutely prove that it's going to hit me, I will nonetheless probably take some evasive action, despite the fact that there isn't proof that it's going to hit me. So there are 4 basic scenarios based on the extremes that might help us decide what we're going to do. One is that we do nothing. I'm talking about extremes. We do nothing by way of mitigation. And at the same extreme, nothing happens. Everything's okay. There's no bad effect of climate change, or at least nothing that we can affect. If we place that bet, that's a big winner. We win all around. The second scenario is we do nothing, and the worst happens. And we have, as a result, an unlivable world. We leave our great-grandchildren in a situation in which they will be, at the very least, a lot less comfortable and perhaps in some difficulty. That's a big loser bet. The third possibility is we do everything. We spend ourselves into the poorhouse by trying to mitigate. Remember, we're talking about extremes. And nothing happens. We spend all that money, and it's a complete waste of money because we didn't have anything to do with it in the first place, and whatever's going to happen. That's a big loser. And the fourth scenario is we spend ourselves into the poorhouse trying to mitigate, and as a result, we save the world from what would otherwise have been a terrible disaster. That's a big win. We have economic chaos at the extreme, because we will have spent ourselves into the poorhouse, but we will have saved the world. So the 2 bets that are good ones are we do nothing, and nothing happens. That's bad. That's a good bet. And the other one is that we do everything and spend ourselves crazy and ruin our economies, but as a result, we save the world. Which, for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, from ecological disaster, where would we place our bet?
You've outlined what makes this a really impossible decision. I mean, I completely understand that you would throw up your hands and say you don't like any of the above. What I've proposed from an economic point of view is just maybe as a thought experiment, but you could actually do it. Suppose that you put a small carbon tax in place, and then you tied the value of that carbon tax to the atmospheric temperature measurements we get from weather satellites. Now, people are going to have to start forecasting what's going to happen to that tax. If they believe what you've heard today, they're going to say, well, that tax isn't going to go up, it might even go down, and so we're not going to worry about it. if they believe what